So in order to do that, we will have to install the Flutter Riverpod. Alright, this is the main Riverpod package. You can see we can just copy that and install it. There's no extra setups to do. So let me open this one back up. Alright, so let's go ahead and install Riverpod. Flutter pub add. I forgot totally to tell it what to add. Alright, it's done that. Now, in order to actually use this, we will create one state, right, to use across our application. So we could call that state, I don't know, counter state, all right. And over here we can create it, and let's call it final counter state will be equal to state provider. Now the state provider is from the Riverpod package. Sorry, it's from the Riverpod package. It provides you with a state. We would create one state. I told you that we'd create one state and use it across the application. Alright, so that way our different states don't have to be blind to what the other state is doing at any point in time. Alright, so we just have one state and we share that state across the application, and we can see it exposes a value that can be modified from outside. So we already exposed a similar value in the main.dart, but then it can't be updated from the outside. But then this state provider gives us the ability to do that. All right, so you can see their example. Usually you don't even call them states, they call them providers. All right, so because it's a state provider, so we say something like counter provider, products provider. It receives something called a reference, gives us a reference to the provider, but that's not important now. But what we really want is to know what this is. This is the states that we're trying to share. All right. In that case, remember that I told you that we have the states, the main state of the stateful widget, and we have the states that we're trying to change. The values that we have to change across the application, or we have to update the UI for, are also called states. Those variables are states, so that is the state of your text. Right, so this is our inner state. So when we do state provider and I hit tab, you can see it provides me with a reference. We can see it's a state provider reference, right? And then we can give it what we want it to provide for us. In this case, it's the counter. All right. In this case, the counter will be 0. All right. We no longer have to save that counter in a counter variable because it's saved in this state already. All right. So let me change this to provider. Alright, so we have our little counter provider. Inside of this provider, it will have a variable. It automatically creates a variable called a state. Alright, so it will be like int state is equal to 0 because I've passed it an integer over here. So that's what basically what it will. That's what you can imagine it as. If it helps you understand that better. Alright, so now in order to actually use that state, remember that we no longer need this state though, because um, we no longer need the help of a stateful widget, because let me delete this one as well. No, where is this? Yes, because now we have a state. We have a general state. Where is it? Counter state. All right. We have a general state to use. All right. So let me change this to stateless widget. All right. So I've changed that to a stateless widget, and we no longer need widget.title. It can just be a title because there's no longer a widget for the now. This is where it gets fun. All right, we will describe. We have to tell the floating action button what to do when it gets pressed. All right, what to do when it gets hit. All right, and in order to do that, I will define a function later, but for now, I will leave it as empty. And let's go ahead and check if we've got anything else to do. Nothing here. Let's go back here as well and change our onPress to be empty as well. So that way we also, alright, so we're still listening to the counter value. So let's go ahead and delete that counter because we no longer need it. But then now, how do we feed our counter value from the state into our widgets that need them. All right, how can we do that? So in order to do that, we will use something called a consumer widget. All right, so in the cases of providers, in order to use them, you have to transform your widget, the widget that will need to use that value. So in this case, we don't need to transform my app because my app does not need the counter. Who needs the counter? It's my homepage because we need it over here. All right. So we will convert, if it was a stateful widget, we would convert it to a consumer stateful widget. If it was a stateless widget, we simply convert it to a consumer widget. Remember, for this one, we convert it to a consumer widget. For a stateful widget, we convert it to a consumer stateful widget. All right, so we go ahead and import Riverpods. All right, and we can see over here we're already getting screamed at. There's something wrong. We can see that my homepage.build, which is our build method, the one that we've currently provided, um, it's given we're collecting only the build context, but it's saying that it's not a valid override of the consumer widget.build. And let's go ahead and hit control or command, hold control command and hit on this, and we can see its build method. Let's see what it does. So we can see what the build method does differently. It doesn't only give us the context, it also gives us the widget reference. All right. So a widget reference is simply, let's see. So it's actually an object that allows your widgets to interact with your provider. So since we already have a counter state provider, we have this provider. How do we interact with this provider? You might think that we could just say, let me show you. You might think that we could just say, let me see, counter provider, and we import that dot, I don't know, dot whatever. So we can't directly, we should not directly interact with the providers. For you to interact with it, you always need something called a widget ref. So that is what the build method from a consumer widget gives to us. So this is our parent. The consumer widget in turn is in turn extending a consumer stateful widget. Consumer stateful widget extends a stateful widget, and we can see that we no longer have to use any stateless widget when we're using a consumer widget. All right. So like what I mean is, in this case, we think we are actually in a stateless widget, or like we don't need a state, but then implicitly the consumer widget is actually using a consumer stateful widget. So now we can see that they're creating a state for us implicitly, but then we can use that state across the application. Alright, so there's nowhere that the consumer widget uses a stateless widget, because for us to even consider using a consumer or a Riverpod state management, we know that we need a state and we need to manage and update that state across our application. So the best thing about this is that it reduces the amount of code that we write, so we no longer have to create a whole stateful widget, which is a lot longer to create than a stateless widget. So now we have our consumer stateless widget, a consumer widget, right? And it provides us with a widget reference, which helps us interact with our provider. Now, in order to interact with our provider, we need to get the state in that provider. And how do we do that? In order to do that, use your reference, the widget reference that you get from the build method, all right? And you say ref dot. Now we have two options. We have read and we have watch. What read does is that read will read the value, right, of that provider once when you build your application. All right, so it will read it once when you build your application, and it will not read it again when you update the value of that provider. It does not update here. So if we use read, it wouldn't update. But if we use watch, watch would watch. It does what it says. It watches. It will read that value in the beginning when the build method gets called, and then it will keep on watching that value. So whenever that value changes, it signifies you and tells your UI, listen, it's changed. It's now 13. You should be 13, something like that. All right, so let's change that from read to watch, and then we tell it what provider we want to watch. In that case, it will be the counter provider. That is what we want to watch. All right, so I think we have to say dot notifier dot state. This is the value of the integer. So let's change that to a string because it's an integer, and that should be the that should give us the value of that thing because at this point is 0, so it should actually just be 0 over here as well. So let me see. In screen A, we've also got a problem. I will convert this from a state. So let me just show you an example of what to do if you were using a stateful widget for some reason. It would be consumer stateful widget, and you can see over here it also wants a consumer state, so we change its state to a consumer state here, and then I think that's it. So no, over here as well, you have to change it to a consumer state, and that's it. Then you can use it. But we're not using a stateful widget. We're also going to convert this one to a stateless widget. So let's change it to a consumer state, sorry, a consumer widget. And then in the build method, we also want the widget ref. So we can simply say that its value will be ref.watch. You can actually just create the variable here in order not to create some long line of text. So let's say final counter will be equal to ref.watch. Let's counter provider. I think this would work as well. So let's see if this works even. But then we can see we have a problem here, all right? That state no provider scope found. Let's go to the documentation. We can see we have a documentation over here. All right, let's read that. So let's get started. So we can see over here that for widgets to be able to read providers, we need to wrap the entire application in a provider scope widget. All right, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's find our widget and wrap it, our main widget, and wrap it in a provider scope. Wrap with widget, provider scope. All right, and then we restart the application. Now let's see. You can also see 0 here, and we can also see 0 there. So let's increase this. Sorry, I haven't built out the increment yet. So on tap of the increment button, we want to say ref.read. Why read in this case? We're reading because we don't need to listen, or we don't need to watch the value of the counter inside of the onPressed function. The onPressed function will just do what it does. It carries out the function or the commands that you give it in here. It carries out the code in here, and then it exits this function. So there's no need to keep watching over here. The current counter provider, let's dot notifier dot state is equal to. So let's do it. Let's make a plus plus then. All right. So let's do that over here and then screen A. Let's do that as well in screen B. And let's see if that. So when we increment here and go to screen A, oh my days, something's wrong. Alright, so we don't need to do this. You can simply use the counter provider and it returns us the integer that we need to listen to. Alright, so let's go ahead and save this. So whenever you need to use the value of the provider, the value of the state provider, alright, you can do this by saying ref.watch that provider or ref.read if you only need to use it once. But then whenever you're updating its value, you have to say read that provider's notifier, and then that will give you access to the state of it, and then we carry out an activity on it. Right, so this is basically the same thing as saying it's equal to ref.read counter provider.notifier.state plus 1. Basically it's the same thing. So then Let's keep it simple. And let's increment this. We can see it's increasing. When we go over here, we can see 6. When we increase it here to 12, we go back, we can see 12 as well. So now that's working perfectly. Alright, so now the next thing we're going to talk about will be Flutter hooks. So for hooks, let's say for example, we had our road UI, so I'm just gonna restore that. VCS operations, show history. Let me go ahead and restore what we had before. Let me see. Alright, let's restore that. And let's go ahead and replace. Alright, so here we have our Ode app, our Ode counter application, and it works, right? It works perfectly. But then we can see that this starts getting tedious, alright? Doing In order to update a value, we have to create a state, and then we have to create another state, like the individual states that we had to update. If we had different things over here to update, all right, maybe we had something else, I don't know, name or age or something, and then as users change those values, each of them would change. Then we would have to have int age, int string name and all that and so forth, right? And then we would have to create functions or write functions to change their values by calling set state over and over and over again. Now that's a tedious task, isn't it? So in order to solve that, Flutter hooks was invented, alright, having to manage a state and updating it by calling set state and so forth. So with Flutter hooks, we can totally even delete our stateful widget, alright. Now I know you're already asking, what is the difference or what is the difference between Riverpod and Flutter hooks? Like, aren't they solving the same problem? Well, no. Flutter hooks manages local state. Alright, so it's also the same thing as a stateful widget. It has the same problems that a stateful widget has, where we can't update the state across different screens. Alright, it will only update within this widget. Alright, but the only thing that it takes away is the need to create a different state and then create our variables in there and have to manage all of those. Alright, so in order to use Flutter hook, let me actually remove this, remove increment counter. I'll create that one later. So let me go ahead and install Flutter hooks then. Let's copy that. Sorry, Control C. No, that's not it. Alright, so in order to use Flutter hooks, we will. Now there's a problem. Oh yeah, I've got some errors over here. Alright, we'll run that later. We'll run that later after we've fixed these issues. So this is the way to create our counter. So now that we no longer have a state, where do we save our variable? We will save it in the build method, alright? So final counter will be equal to let's say use state. Alright, this is what it does. It creates a variable and subscribes to it. Alright, so whenever the value of that variable of whenever the value of that state, this is a state, whenever the value of that state gets updated, even look, yeah. Alright, so their example is also using the counter example. That's beautiful. Alright, so whenever we change the value of that state, alright, it automatically tells everyone who's using it the value of this has changed. So update your widget, alright. So this is how to use hooks. So you no longer have to create a host stateful widget. You can just use the Flutter hooks and use the useState function. This will create a stateful widget for you it doesn't really create a stateful widget, all right? But then it creates something like a stateful widget called a value notifier. It basically just notifies your whoever's using the values inside of it, all right, that the value has changed. So now we can just put its value to be 0. And then over here, in order to get that 0, similar to what we had with Riverpod, we could just call ref dot watch, and we had the put in the counter provider. In this case, we would say counter dot value, and that gets us the value inside of it. In this case, it's an integer, as you can see, but text takes a string, so we will convert that to a string. And then for incrementing the value, we will simply do this, and then it will simply say counter.value plus plus. Right, and that should, without set state or whatever, that should update that local state within here. That works for this. So let's go ahead and run the application. Alright, so now we can see there's another error. Similar to what we had with the Riverpod, where we had to go to the main.dart and wrap it with a provider scope. In this case, what they want us to do, let's go to documentation so you can see how this works, is that, yes, we can see. So the same way that Riverpod makes you change your stateless widgets to a consumer widget, this person makes you change your widget to a hook widget. Alright, so Riverpod and hooks are similar in this way. Let's restart the application and let's see where that error comes from. Oh, forgive me, I put the hook in the wrong place. This is where we need to put the hook in my home page. Let's do a hot restart and see. We can see that's happened, right? When we hit this button, we can see it actually updates, alright? It updates. Oops, sorry. So now that's Flutter Hook, alright? Flutter Hooks provide a way. Now you could totally create that. You could totally think that you should be able to create this useState counter out here, alright? And then maybe just say provider counter dot value plus equal to whatever, and then update it, I don't know, on the other screen. But when we do that and reload, you can see, let's see, you can see that there's errors, all right? So it was used after being disposed. This just means that you can't use the hook variable outside of a widget, outside of a hook widget. It has to be in the build method of a hook widget, all right? It simply cannot be outside the context of a hook widget, and that's that, alright? So when we do it that way, then it will work. So that's why Flutter Hooks helps with local set state replacement, alright? It replaces the need to create an entire state and then manage and update the UI based on that state, alright? So that's Flutter Hooks, and that's how it ties into stateful widgets.